On the cold and snow-covered morning of February 2nd, 152, a haunting silence descended upon the Vatican Palace in Rome. Outside, the snowflakes fell in quiet harmony, while inside, one room held a fate intertwined with power, politics, and the destiny of a woman. 3 men, with faces marked by deep seriousness, stood silently in the corner of the room. Their presence made no sound, save for the whispers of their minds, feeling the weight of the decision that was unfolding that night. In the room, the flickering light of candles cast shadows across a bed where Lucrezia Borgia, a 22-year-old woman of extraordinary beauty and power, lay exhausted. Her body was drenched in blood and sweat-soaked sheets, and her breath was labored, as though she had reached the limits of her strength. But the strength within her, the fire burning in her eyes, had not faltered. Her eyes, though weary, held the weight of calculations, a resolve to turn the tide of her fate into her own game. Her thighs trembled, her breath deep and heavy, like a sigh that escaped from a place of untold pain. Her nails left deep marks in the sheets, as if she were bound by some unseen force. But there was no defeat in her eyes, no sign of surrender in her body, something the men standing there could never understand. Her gaze was fixed, not in despair but in calculation, the calm presence of someone who had made peace with their circumstances, yet was plotting their next move. They say the body never lies, and Lucretia's body, soaked in the marks of past humiliation and power struggles, told a story that no one in that room could truly read. Her skin, red from the friction, was not the sign of passion, it was resistance. Resistance against the game that had been thrust upon her, yet still, she fought back in silence. The marks on her lips weren't whispers of love or desire. They were the symbols of strategy. Every gasp, every breath that was noted by the witnesses wasn't of pleasure. It was an act of survival. It was not just a body, but a battlefield where every moment was calculated, where every sigh was part of a larger, unspoken plan. In that room, where everything was being documented and recorded according to the established rules, Lucrezia Borgia was no longer just a woman. She was a player in a game, using her body as a tool, her mind as the mastermind behind it all. In her humiliation, there lay strength, a strategy not to strengthen her body, but to sharpen her mind. Lucrezia was no longer the person she once was. She wasn't the girl her father had sold as a mere pawn in the political game, nor was she the widow who buried 2 husbands for political reasons. She wasn't the woman who smiled in front of the public while hiding her tears behind closed doors. She had transformed into someone else, someone forged by the game of power, politics and survival. Now she was a duchess, a woman who understood a secret of power that her father's webs could never entrap. She was no longer just a pawn. She had discovered a secret, a hidden truth about power, one that had escaped her father's intricate schemes. Lucrezia understood that if your body was used as the battlefield, at least you should make sure to win that war on your terms. She had become the ruler of her own destiny, her mind sharpened by the rules of a game she was now prepared to master. And when, by morning, the last witness signed the final document, and when all the evidence was sent to Papa, when the men left the room, Lucrezia slowly rose, draping herself in a golden silk robe, and for the first time in her life, smiled without pretense. By the time morning came, when the last witness signed the final document, when all the evidence was sent to Papa, and when the men left the room, Lucrezia slowly rose. She wrapped herself in a golden silk robe, her movements slow, deliberate, almost regal. And for the first time in her life, she smiled without a trace of pretense or disguise. This was not the smile of a victim, but of someone who had just realized a powerful truth that no man in that room could ever understand. She had learned that a woman, once reduced to mere property, documented like cattle, could rise to control the entire herd. This was the moment when Lucrezia realized her true power, her body, her weakness, her humiliation. These were no longer signs of subjugation, but tools she had mastered. She had become the victor in her own game, and that victorious smile marked the beginning of her reign. This is the night that changed the map of Europe forever. The agreements signed on paper were not the ones that truly determined the fate of the world. It was the new balance of power that was born under the sheets, in the deep shadows between silent witnesses. That night, Lucrezia Borgia's fate took a path where a single decision on one day determined the future of an entire region. But this part of Lucrezia's story was not just a political bargain. Her value was not simply set as a powerful body. It was a harsh reality that, as an heir, She was meant not only to strengthen her family's power, but also her life decisions were part of a transactional strategy aimed at consolidating the family's power by using her body. In that room, where she was controlled under the guise of protection, Lucrezia was fully aware that it wasn't her game but her family's power play. She was a tool in this game, a tool whose sole purpose was one thing: to achieve the goals of power. The price of her body was calculated through a deep political equation, and all of this was part of her father's strategy, who was constantly working to expand his power with new moves. The silent witnesses of that night, the decisions being made on her body, and the true nature of the power hidden within her journey reveal to us an era where human destiny was used merely as a tool in the game of power. Lucrezia Borgia became the greatest example of this. She was not just a marriage contract, but a political decision that changed not only her life, but the fate of all of Italy. On April 18, 1480, Lucrezia Borgia was born in the town of Subiaco, into a family that had already woven a web of politics and power. She was the daughter of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia and Vanozza de Catane, and her birth was not just the arrival of a child into the world, but the beginning of something far more calculated. Rodrigo, who would later be known as Pope Alexander VI, had not made an ordinary plan for his daughter. He had already calculated that his bloodline's women would prove to be more powerful weapons in conquering Italy than any army, and for that, Lucrezia was not trained for spirituality or innocence. She was being groomed as a political tool, meant to play a role in the game of power and dominance. At the age of 4, Lucrezia had already learned that her value was not in her body or innocence, but in what she knew and what she could do. Her worth would be measured in ducats, alliances, and contracts. Instead of learning sacred texts, her governess taught her Latin so she could understand the marriage contracts that would come her way. By the time she was 10, she was not only fluent in Italian, Spanish, and French, but she had also mastered the most important language of all: silence, a language that would serve her well in hiding her abilities and her wisdom. Her beauty, which only grew with time, was like a curse, but one that had become a powerful blessing. Her golden hair shimmered like gold, and her pale skin glowed like the marble of St. Peter's. Her blue eyes were not just a symbol of innocence, but they carried a glimmer of intelligence that shone like that of a warrior. When the ambassadors came to the Vatican, they did not see her as a child. They saw her as a work of art, a beautiful creation that would soon be available to be sold into another's hands of power. Lucrezia was only 11 years old when her first suitor arrived. Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro, who was 30 years older than her, was a man in a sorry state. His breath reeked of wine, and his hands trembled from his addiction. In 1493, when he came to marry Lucrezia, she had barely crossed the threshold of puberty, and her father handed her over as easily as signing a check without hesitation, as if it was a mere transaction. There was no emotional connection behind this marriage. It was merely a political alliance. Lucrezia's beauty was being used as a commodity, and her innocence was part of her father's strategy. But once the marriage began, Giovanni Sforza's weaknesses and cowardice became painfully obvious. He proved to be politically useless, and the worst part was that he failed to fulfill his marital duties, which was a crucial need for the Borgia family. Pope Alexander VI needed heirs, grandsons, and successors to solidify his power, but when it became clear that Giovanni was nothing more than a decorative piece, his annulment became inevitable. The accusation was simple: he was sexually impotent. By the time Lucrezia was 16, she gave a public testimony in the ecclesiastical court, stating that her husband had failed to perform his marital duties. This testimony not only caused public humiliation, but was also documented, sealed with the papal seal. Even her father's power couldn't intervene in this matter. It was a game of politics, and Lucrezia was completely ensnared in it. Giovanni, after his failure, fled Rome and swore revenge, but it no longer mattered. Lucrezia had learned the first and most important lesson of Borgia power. Weak men are discarded like old clothes. Once they fail, they lose all value. Second marriage and a new beginning of love. In 1498, Lucrezia's second marriage took place. This time, her husband was Alfonso d'Aragona, the Duke of Biscaglie, and he was everything Giovanni had never been. Alfonso was young, handsome, and of royal Neapolitan blood. At 18, his face was angelic, and no one saw any political cunning in him. His manners, compared to the harshness of the Vatican court, were gentle and charming. Now, Lucrezia tasted the kind of love she had never imagined before. The softness and affection in her life with Alfonso were unlike anything she had experienced prior. Lucrezia and Alfonso experienced a love that transcended words for 2 years. It wasn't just a physical relationship. It was a deep bond where Alfonso treated Lucrezia with respect as a woman, not just as a political tool. He spent time with her, took her on walks through the Vatican gardens, and whispered secrets to her that no one else would hear. With Alfonso, Lucrezia felt for the first time that perhaps love and politics could coexist. In their lives, a son, Rodrigo, was born, and with him, Lucrezia dreamed a new dream, the dream where love and politics could find a balance. But for the Borgia family, unapproved happiness was never tolerated. On July 15, 1500, Alfonso d'Aragona became the target of assassins on the steps of St. Peter's. Though he was wounded, he continued to fight for his life. However, his recovery proved to be a long and painful process. While he was resting in his room, someone came during the night and finished the job. His throat was strangled with silk thread, the same silk Lucrezia used to adorn herself. In the morning, Lucrezia found his cold body. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she simply sat beside him in silence. She gently touched his body, feeling the coldness on his face until the doctors arrived. It was in that moment that Lucrezia learned the Borgia family's second lesson. Love is a luxury that pawns cannot afford. It was a harsh truth for her, but she had learned that in politics, love was seen as a weakness, and she had now become part of that game. Her father allowed Lucrezia 3 months of mourning, but as soon as her days of grief ended, he presented her with a new list, a new suitor. For Alexander VI, a young widow was a valuable asset that could not be wasted without his eyes being dry. Lucrezia's worth wasn't just in her emotions, but in the political leverage she carried, and her father understood this truth well. The audience hall of the Vatican now resembled an auction room where perfumes, gold, marble, and sealed marriage contracts were being presented as a new trade. In January 1501, Lucrezia Borgia was officially on the market, and this time, the circumstances were different than before. Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, was no ordinary noble. He was a military engineer, an expert in artillery, and the ruler of a prosperous city in northern Italy. He was 35 years old and had buried his first wife without any drama. When his emissaries arrived in Rome, they were not just there to woo her, but to negotiate. They had guaranteed 100,000 ducats, the castle of Cento, the duchy of Nepi, and some additional terms, ensuring that the marriage would be fully and legally documented, with all decisions made according to their terms. They would not accept any annulment that did not fully fulfill their growing claims of power. These conditions were so extraordinary and lavish that even the Borgia family was taken aback. Alexander VI read these terms without hesitation and signed them, because his daughter was worth every ducat, every castle, every document in exchange. However, when Lucrezia read the specific clause, her gaze immediately became hard. The emissaries of d'Este did not just want the marriage to be completed. They demanded documentary proof 3 times, all within one night, with some intervals, to ensure that both spouses were not only healthy, but also active. The sexual act was to be transformed into a documented event, with every breath, every movement recorded as legal evidence. They didn't want anyone to claim that the marriage was merely a fabricated reality. Her body was no longer hers, her nurse whispered, as she prepared to leave for Ferrara. It was never truly hers. Lucrezia didn't respond, as a dangerous thought crossed her mind. If my body is going to become a weapon, then at least I will choose the music of this weapon. The journey from Rome to Ferrara lasted for 2 weeks. Lucrezia traveled silently, surrounded by a group of papal riders who were guarding her and carrying treasures, silks, jewels, and the documents of her marriage contract. As she passed through each city, people would gather on the streets to catch a glimpse of her. Some called her Papa's whore, others referred to her as a poisoner, and some labelled her the Black Widow. But amidst all this, no one knew that the woman who was now the target of these public taunts was soon going to redefine the role of a duchess in the world of the Renaissance. She was a woman whose name would soon be written in the pages of history, marking the dawn of a new era. Alfonso came to meet Lucrezia at the gates of Ferrara for the first time. As he approached her, he did not dismount from his horse, but his eyes were scanning Lucrezia, as if he were examining a map of fortifications. His gaze was intensely scrutinizing, and Lucrezia met it with equal intensity. In that moment, they both realized that this marriage was not based on love, but rather a political calculation. At first glance, there was a silent attraction between them. Alfonso was the man who was even more striking than in the portraits, tall, dark, and with the scent of gunpowder on his hands, signaling that he worked alongside his soldiers in the battlefield. His hazel eyes held no deceit, and he regarded Lucrezia as an equal, not just an object. Lucrezia also understood that Alfonso was a man who recognized not only her body, but also her intellect. They both knew that this marriage was not just a challenge of enmity or alliance between them. It was a political battle that would require both of them to bring their strengths to win. The wedding date was set for February 1st, and the official completion was to take place on February 2nd. During the final week, while the notary and doctor were preparing the documents, Lucrezia and Alfonso shared private conversations that only they knew. This wasn't a formal exchange. They shared their thoughts, interests, and dreams. They discussed books, wars, and the machines designed by Alfonso, and Lucrezia spoke of the beauty of the music she composed. They discovered that both were fluent in Latin, and they both despised the hypocrisy of the papacy. They also realized that this marriage was more than just a political move. Its purpose wasn't only to defeat or succeed in politics, but rather, it marked a new journey where they had to carve their own place. One night, when the wedding preparations were at their peak, Alfonso found Lucrezia in the palace library. She was reading Vegetius de Re Militari, a book on military strategy that was considered essential for any commander. Alfonso asked her, "Are you ready for battle?" Lucrezia, without lifting her gaze, replied, "Tomorrow, we begin a war that will last for decades." That same night, they shared their first kiss. It wasn't a kiss of love, but a political vow, meant to forge a new path. Yet it was real and marked a new beginning for both of them. The day of the wedding arrived, and it was much more than just a ceremony. On this day, Lucrezia and Alfonso took the most important and complex step of their lives. But behind it was not just emotion, but also a part of the game of politics and power. 500 guests were present, but the real story was between the two of them. The room was filled with fragrance, the dim light of candles, melted wax, and a strange scent that had become a symbol of fear. This fear wasn't natural. It was the fear between two people who knew that if they made any mistake, their fate would be changed forever. Lucrezia had bathed in rosewater and oils to soothe her skin, protecting it from the repeated friction. Her hair was adorned with pearls, and she was wrapped in a soft silk robe, which was more like a promise than a shield of protection. Alfonso wore a burgundy-colored tunic, soft and flexible, perfectly suited for their private performance. The witnesses were already in their designated places. Julia de la Rubière, the papal notary, was there to record every part of the process, with ink, seals, and documents in hand. Master Tirani, the court doctor of Ferrara, was there to confirm that both Lucrezia and Alfonso were in full health. Don Ramiro de Lorca, the envoy of the King of Spain, was there to document every minute detail. Everything was arranged like an international agreement, and every step held immense importance, because this was not just a wedding, it was a political statement. At 11 p.m., the first candle was lit, and the last one was meant to burn until morning. They both had to prove that their bodies were not just a political contract, but fully active and in sync with each other. Alfonso took the first step. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from hidden anger. He disliked this humiliation as much as Lucrezia did, but he had accepted the rules of the game. He whispered in Lucrezia's ear, "Please forgive me for what we must do." Without hesitation, Lucrezia replied, "I don't need forgiveness. I just need us to win." The first act began. Initially like two strangers trying to touch each other amidst witnesses and piercing gazes, but as their bodies synchronized, something unexpected happened. What had started as a business transaction now became a reality. They were finally acknowledging each other. When the second act took place, it was even more intense than the first. Their bodies were already familiar with each other, but now signs of exhaustion began to show. Lucrezia felt the irritation from the repeated friction, and Alfonso was under the pressure to prove his strength in front of the witnesses and not fail. But this time, they adopted a new approach. They turned the act into a personal competition, where both tested their physical and mental strength. They sought to prove that they could emerge victorious from this struggle, fully pushing their limits. This time, Lucrezia took full control. She mounted Alfonso, not only controlling the pace, but also determining the depth, proving that a woman who was merely seen as property in documents could have complete control over her fate and her body. Alfonso followed her lead, understanding that the sharing of power between them was essential and that they could only succeed together. The notary wrote, "The second act was completed, demonstrating active cooperation between both spouses." The doctor noted, signs of satisfactory response and reassurance were evident. The emissary completed his report. Confirmation of virile strength and female reproductive capacity. At 3 a.m., they both prepared to begin the third and final act. Their bodies were now protesting. Lucrezia's skin had turned red, and her muscles were exhausted. Alfonso maintained his strength solely through willpower, drenched in sweat, trying to muster the energy within himself to complete the task. But this was the moment when something happened that no witness could record. They began to love each other, not in the poetic sense, but in a practical love, one that marked the beginning of a new bond between them. This love evolved into a connection that symbolized harmony. Both understood that they had found in each other a true partner, someone who was aligned with them in this political and physical struggle. When they had finally completed the act, and when the last witness signed off on the documents, and all the evidence had been sent to Rome and Spain, Lucrezia and Alfonso were finally alone after 7 hours of humiliation. They were tired, physically drained, and documented as successful, but their smiles showed that they had won this battle. The documents arrived in Rome 3 days later. Alexander VI read them and let out a sigh of satisfaction, like a merchant signing an important contract. His daughter had fulfilled her duty, and the alliance with Ferrara was now a reality through documents, blood, and words. But neither Alexander VI nor any witness knew that something else had been forged in that room. Something far more dangerous than any alliance. It was a relationship in which both partners were equally bound to each other. Lucrezia and Alfonso realized that they were no longer just victims of others' incomplete dreams in the game of power, but had become partners on a new path. A few months later, Lucrezia and Alfonso's marriage proved that a woman, who was once used merely as a political pawn, could not only transform herself into a powerful politician, but also create an entire system. Lucrezia ran the Ferrara court, managing alliances and intrigues, while Alfonso developed Italy's most advanced military weaponry. Their source of power lay in their partnership, and together they established a political system that shifted the balance of power across Europe. Lucrezia, along with her husband, launched an annual cultural gathering, inviting Europe's best poets, artists, and philosophers. But this gathering wasn't just for the promotion of culture, it also served as a foundation for political strategy. Lucrezia used this event as a means to strengthen her influence and establish political connections. Lucrezia's family had now become the owner of the world's most powerful intelligence network, while Alfonso's army earned the title of the world's most formidable military force. Together, they forged a combination of power that was blending politics, culture, and military strength, creating a new system that was reshaping their world. This couple, who laid the foundation for the political power of a new era, is proof that a partnership between a man and a woman, based on shared strategy and strength, can create a power that lasts for decades. Lucrezia faced pain and hardship 3 times in her life, but she always overcame these challenges with better strategy. Her story of success remains a lesson for the world to this day. This is the story in which Lucrezia Borgia created her own reality and, through it, established a new system that not only influenced the politics of her time, but also impacted the generations to come.